Hey, if my voice sounds a little strange, it's because I have a cold. Sorry. To be honest, we're both lucky I'm feeling well enough to make a show at all. Anyway. So, the big summer event Marvel Comics has been teasing for the last few months turns out to be a revival of Secret Wars, a fondly remembered crossover mega event tied to a line of action figures in the mid-80s that was mainly an excuse to shake up the status quo of various characters, but managed to be a big, fun, nutty superhero romp all on its own. This Secret Wars is something different, though, apparently aiming to be the first full-scale reboot of the entire Marvel universe.
Comics are weird.
This is good though, because I've been meaning to do an episode for some time on how the concept of time works in the Marvel and DC Comics universes forever. Basically, apart from what decade it is, the answer is usually not very much unless the story says otherwise. A Batman story can supposedly only last a few days, but stretch out for 6 monthly issues, but if he runs into Superman, it doesn't necessarily mean that Superman's books are running on the same weird timeline. Like so much else in American comics, managing time is based on a mutual I won't bring it up if you don't bring it up agreement between the reader and the writer, to a point. Eventually, the contradictions and long-term temporal issues of having characters who lead active, complex, interconnected lives but also aren't really allowed to age pile up and you have to deal with them, usually in big, sweeping gestures that also wind up directed at fixing stuff deemed to be broken in other ways, i.e. you might as well vacuum if you're going to move all the furniture anyway. For DC, this typically means the Crises, a succession of crossover events that we've talked about at length previously that aimed to both simplify and improve the DC Comics universe at various points by blowing it up in such a way that eliminated anything the current editorial board didn't like, and reassembling it in such a way as to preserve or revive anything said editorial board did like. Usually, time itself isn't a big factor in that regard. DC has so many fictional cities, countries, etc., that its heroes rarely get wrapped up in real-world problems, and in instances when they do, well, DC just kind of stops talking about them. Like that time the Joker was made the Iranian representative to the United Nations. No, really, go look it up. Everyone forgets that part because it was in the story where Jason Todd died and that kind of overwhelms everything, but yeah, that's totally something that happened. Marvel tends to work differently. When the modern Marvel universe began in the 60s, the editorial mandate wasn't just to maintain a solid continuity with other books, but also with the real world, to reference popular culture, tie storylines to real events, the whole shebang. The characters even got to age. Some of them. Kind of. Peter Parker went through high school and graduated college. The Fantastic Four had a kid. But as the years wore on and time stretching was starting to reach the breaking point, Marvel decided to quietly adopt a sliding scale of time. Basically, from about the late 70s onward, all Marvel stories are presumed to be taking place roughly in the immediate present, and everything that happened in all the comics from the first appearance of the Fantastic Four onwards still happened, just not over a period of 50 years. Instead, it's been more like 10 years in universe. Or less, or more. Always a few, never really that long. And that's how it's always worked since. What time is it in Marvel? Now. So when did Galactus first appear? A few years ago. When did the Dark Phoenix happen? A few years ago. When did Civil War happen? A few years ago. You get the idea. All that ever changes are era-specific details, like how originally Tony Stark got his injuries in Vietnam and now got them in Afghanistan, and we just pretend that all the other stories about previous military conflicts were all either Iraq or Afghanistan instead of what they originally were also. The only point in time that remains fixed is that Captain America fought in World War II. That doesn't need to change because they just keep making the length of time he was frozen longer. But when did he get thawed out? A few years ago. What that's always meant is that Marvel has never really needed a Crisis-style reboot to fix their continuity. It's self-correcting, sort of. So the question becomes, why do it now? Well, a big part of it, especially if you've been following some of the other recent big event stories in the comics, looks to be getting rid of / integrating the Ultimate Marvel Universe, which no longer serves a purpose as easier-to-digest versions of classic characters for a new audience is now simply called the movies. So basically look for the aftermath of Secret Wars to involve bringing over and making official the good Ultimate Universe ideas like Miles Morales and, I think he might actually be it. Maybe Ultimate Nick Fury, too, since people know him from the movies. And that is probably the big unspoken answer to this whole question of why do a reboot. To bring the Marvel Comics universe and the immensely profitable Marvel Cinematic Universe into greater alignment. Not necessarily to make the books more palatable to any new movie fans. I doubt anyone in publishing seriously thinks that many people come out of the Avengers thinking, wow, that was great. You know what we should do now? Go to an inconveniently located, poorly laid out store and buy overpriced books about the much more confusing versions of what we just saw. No, I imagine the idea will be to reshape the comics so as to better serve as idea test kitchens for future movies and TV shows, which likely means pumping up the importance of characters like Iron Man or the Inhumans and the Guardians of the Galaxy in the new Marvel lore, while significantly downgrading the universe-wide importance of the X-Men and Fantastic Four characters since the movie rights are owned by other studios and they don't want to promote them. I'm not really sure what to think of all this. It doesn't necessarily bother me in a practical sense, but if this does wind up where the Marvel Universe is just like post-crisis DC where every other storyline is about explaining whether something that happened before actually still happened, I'll be kind of bummed out. That the Marvel Universe was functional was always part of its charm. Will that still be the case? Time will tell, I hope. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.